Have you ever felt the stinging silence of a room turning against you? Sarah Miller stood on that auction block, her knuckles white against the handle of a Christmas basket that held her last hope. The town of Oakhaven watched, some with pity, most with scorn, as the auctioneer called for a bid. Once, twice. Silence. She was the widow nobody wanted, the outcast. But just as the gavel was about to strike the final blow to her dignity, the saloon doors groaned open. A shadow fell across the room. A man everyone feared had just walked in, and he wasn't there to buy a meal. He was there to buy a war, and he started it with $5 gold. The winter of 1884 was cruel to the Wyoming Territory, but it was cruelest to Sarah Miller. The town of Oakhaven was buried under 3 feet of snow, the pine trees bowing in reverence to the frost. Inside the town hall, however, the air was thick with the smell of roasting ham, cider, and the overwhelming perfume of judgment. It was the annual Christmas box social, the biggest event of the year. The premise was simple. The ladies of the town prepared a lunch basket for 2, wrapped it in ribbons and secrecy, and the men bid on them. The highest bidder won the lunch and the pleasure of the ladies' company for the afternoon. The money went to the church roof fund, or so they said. Sarah knew better. In Oakhaven, money went where influence flowed, and right now Sarah had neither. Sarah stood near the back of the stage, smoothing the wrinkles of her faded grey calico dress. It was the only respectable thing she owned since Thomas died 8 months ago. Thomas Miller, a good man with bad luck and a worse heart condition. He'd left her with a rocky plot of land, a half-built barn, and a mountain of silence where his laughter used to be. "Look at her," a whisper hissed from the front row. It was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, hiding behind a fan that did nothing to muffle her malice, wearing grey to a Christmas social. You'd think she'd have the decency to stay home. "She can't afford to stay home, Martha," another voice replied, dripping with faux sympathy. "I heard the bank is coming for the Miller farm come spring. She's probably looking for a husband to pay the lien." Sarah kept her chin high, though her hands trembled. They weren't wrong. The basket in her hands wasn't just a lunch, it was a plea. Inside, she had packed the last of her winter stores, a jar of preserved peaches, fresh biscuits made with the last scrape of her flour barrel, and a venison pie she had traded her wedding ring's silver polish to acquire the meat for. The auctioneer, a rotund man named Jedediah Smith, who sweated profusely despite the chill, banged his gavel. "All right, settle down, folks. Next up, we have a basket wrapped in, well, it's a sturdy red flannel." Sarah stepped forward. The chatter in the hall died instantly. It wasn't the respectful silence of anticipation. It was the cold vacuum of exclusion. "A fine basket by Mrs. Sarah Miller," Jedediah announced, though his voice lacked the gusto he'd used for the mayor's daughter moments before. "Do I hear 50 cents? Silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, emphasizing the stillness inside. Men looked at their boots. The younger cowboys, who usually hooted and hollered, suddenly found great interest in the ceiling. To bid on Sarah Miller was to bid on a woman cursed by bad luck, a woman the church elders deemed too proud because she refused to sell her land to the mayor for pennies on the dollar. "Come now," Jedediah said, shifting uncomfortably. "Surely someone's hungry. A quarter. 25 cents for a home-cooked meal." Sarah felt the heat rise up her neck, staining her cheeks. She gripped the basket so tight the wicker bit into her skin. "Please," she prayed silently. "Just one bid. Don't let me walk off this stage with nothing." Mayor Josiah Higgins sat in the front row, his thumbs hooked in his vest, a smug grin plastered beneath his walrus mustache. He stared directly at Sarah, his eyes communicating a dark promise. "Give up the land, Sarah, and this humiliation ends." He made a show of checking his pocket watch, signaling to everyone that she was wasting their time. 10 cents, Jedediah tried, his voice barely a squeak. A titter of laughter rippled through the women. "Going once," Jedediah said, raising the gavel. Sarah's eyes burned. She wouldn't cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. She prepared to turn around, to take her basket and walk out into the snow, knowing that tomorrow she would have to pack her bags. Going twice. The gavel began its descent. Wham! The double doors at the back of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown wide with such force that the iron hinges shrieked. A gust of freezing wind swirled into the room, carrying snow and the scent of wood smoke and raw leather. The candlelight flickered violently, threatening to die out. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a figure that seemed to block out the winter sun. He was massive, easily 6'4", wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat that made him look like the beast itself. Snow clung to his beard, a thick, dark tangle that hid half his face, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes. A rifle was slung casually over one shoulder, and a bowie knife the size of a man's forearm rested on his hip. It was Elias Burke. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Mothers pulled their children closer. Elias Burke wasn't part of polite society. He was a mountain man, a trapper who lived high up in the Bitterroot Peaks. Rumors clung to him like burrs. They said he killed a grizzly with his bare hands. They said he was a deserter from the Civil War, or a bounty hunter who got tired of the chase. They said he had a fortune in gold buried in his cabin, or perhaps a graveyard of enemies. He stomped the snow off his boots, the sound echoing like gunshots on the wooden floor. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the mayor. His eyes, dark and piercing like obsidian, were locked on the stage, locked on Sarah. He walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, men scrambling to pull their chairs in, terrified of brushing against his coat. The spur on his boot jingled, a lonely, dangerous sound. He stopped 10 feet from the stage. He looked at Jedediah, who was trembling so hard he nearly dropped the gavel. "Is the lady's basket for sale?" Elias's voice was a low rumble, like thunder rolling through a canyon. It wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. Jedediah swallowed. Well, yes, Mr. Burke. It is. The bidding is open." "Nobody bid," Mayor Higgins shouted from the front row, standing up to reclaim his authority. "The auction is over, Burke. You're interrupting a private community event." Elias slowly turned his head to look at the mayor. He didn't speak. He just stared. The mayor's face reddened, but he sat back down, cowed by the sheer physical threat radiating from the mountain man. Elias turned back to Sarah. For a fleeting second, the hardness in his eyes softened. He saw the fray on her cuffs. He saw the defiance in her jaw. He saw a woman standing alone against a pack of wolves. $5, Elias said. The room erupted. $5, Mrs. Gable shrieked, clutching her pearls. That's indecent. $5 was 2 weeks' wages for a cowhand. It was enough to buy a good horse or feed a family for a month. For a lunch basket, it was madness. It was an insult to everyone else who had bid 50 cents. "I have $5, Jedediah squeaked, his eyes bulging. He looked at the mayor, hoping for a counterbid, but Higgins was fuming, his face purple. He wasn't going to spend $5 on Sarah Miller, not when he planned to evict her for free. Any other bids?" Jedediah asked weakly. Elias reached into his coat. He didn't pull out a coin purse. He pulled out a small leather pouch, untied the string, and upended it into his massive, calloused palm. 5 heavy gold coins glinted in the candlelight. He tossed them onto the table in front of the mayor. They clattered loudly, spinning and settling with a ring of pure value. "Sold," Elias said. He didn't wait for the gavel. He walked up the steps to the stage. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had seen Elias Burke in town before, trading furs, but she had never been this close. He smelled of pine resin, cold air and tobacco. He was terrifying, yes, but as he stopped in front of her, she realized he wasn't looking at her like a piece of meat. He was looking at her like she was the only real thing in the room. "Ma'am," he grunted, tipping the brim of his hat. He held out a hand, large, scarred, and surprisingly steady. Sarah looked at the mayor, who was glaring daggers. She looked at the townswomen, who were whispering scandal behind their hands. Then she looked at Elias. She shifted the basket to her left arm and placed her small, work-rough hand into his. His grip was warm, enveloping hers completely. "Mr. Burke," she whispered, her voice steady, "I hope you have an appetite." "For your cooking, Mrs. Miller," he said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "I'd ride through hell and back." He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, turned her away from the gaping crowd, and led her off the stage. They walked down the aisle together, the widow and the beast, leaving a trail of stunned silence and gold coins in their wake. The scandal had just begun. The air outside the town hall was sharp enough to freeze the breath in your lungs, but for the first time in months, Sarah didn't feel the cold. The adrenaline of the auction, combined with the sheer, massive presence of Elias Burke walking beside her, created a strange heat in her chest. He led her not to the hitching rail where the townfolk tied their nags, but around the corner to a secluded patch of pine where a large black stallion was hitched to a simple, rugged cutter, a sleigh built for speed and deep snow. "Up you go," Elias grunted. He didn't wait for her to struggle with the high step. He placed his hands on her waist, his touch firm and respectful, searing through the thin fabric of her coat, and lifted her as if she weighed no more than a sack of feathers. As he climbed in beside her, the sleigh dipped under his weight. He grabbed a heavy buffalo robe from the back and threw it over their laps. It was thick, warm, and smelled of the wild. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The social creates tables in the square." Elias flicked the reins. "Those folks back there just tried to buy your dignity for a nickel, Mrs. Miller. I don't reckon you want to eat in front of them." He was right. The thought of sitting across from Mrs. Gable and Mayor Higgins while they whispered about the mountain man and the widow was unbearable. They rode in silence for 20 minutes, the only sound the rhythmic shuck-shuck of the sleigh runners cutting through the powder and the jingle of the horse's tack. Elias steered them out of Oakhaven, up a winding ridge trail that overlooked the valley. He stopped at a clearing known as Eagle's Roost. From here the town looked small, insignificant, just a smattering of toy houses buried in white. Elias tied the reins and turned to her. "This suit you?" "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. "I haven't been this far from the farm since the funeral." Elias nodded solemnly. He reached for the basket. "Let's see what $5 bought me." Sarah's stomach knotted. Now came the shame. She watched as his large, scarred fingers unlatched the delicate wicker lid. He pulled out the jar of peaches, the biscuits, and the small venison pie. It looked so meager against his massive frame. He was a man who probably ate whole rabbits for breakfast. This was a bird's meal. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, unable to stop herself. "It's not much. The flour was the last of the barrel, and the peaches are from 2 summers ago. It's poor fare for a man like you." Elias paused, a biscuit halfway to his mouth. He looked at the food, then at her. His dark eyes, usually so guarded, softened into something that looked painfully like longing. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded rough and sweet on his tongue. "I've been trapping up on the bitterroot for 6 months. I've eaten hardtack that would break a tooth and jerky tough enough to shoe a mule. This—" He took a bite of the biscuit, closing his eyes as he chewed. He swallowed and looked at her with intense seriousness. "This tastes like a home. I haven't tasted home in 10 years." He broke the venison pie in half and handed the larger portion to her. "I can't," she protested. "You paid for it." "And I'm saying we share it," he insisted, pressing it into her gloved hand. "I don't eat alone when there's company." They ate there, suspended above the world. As the initial awkwardness melted away, the conversation began to flow. Sarah found herself talking, really talking, for the first time in forever. She told him about Thomas, about how hard he tried to fix the barn roof before his heart gave out. She told him about the chickens freezing last week. She told him about her fear of the bank. Elias listened. He didn't interrupt with advice or pity. He just listened, chewing slowly, nodding. "Why did you do it?" Sarah asked suddenly, the question hanging in the cold air. "Why spend $5 on me? You could have had the mayor's daughter's basket." She packed roasted pheasant. Elias wiped crumbs from his beard. He looked out over the valley, his expression darkening. "I knew Thomas," Elias said quietly. Sarah gasped. "You did?" "Found him 2 winters back. His wagon had thrown a wheel in a drift near the pass. He was freezing to death. We fixed the wheel, shared a fire. He talked about you the whole night, said you were the steel in his spine, said he didn't deserve you." Elias turned his gaze back to her. "When I walked into that hall and saw those vultures circling you, saw the wife of a good man standing there like she was worth nothing, I couldn't abide it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He hesitated, then handed it to her. "What is this?" Sarah asked. "Something Thomas gave me that night. Said if anything happened to him, I should see it gets to you. I'm not a man for town, Sarah. I stayed away. I should have brought it sooner." Sarah unfolded the paper. It was a crude map of their property, drawn in Thomas's shaky hand. On the back, written in charcoal, were 3 words: North Creek. Gold. Sarah stared at it, her heart stopping. "Gold. Thomas never mentioned gold." "He found traces," Elias said. "He was afraid if he told anyone, the mayor would find a way to steal the land before he could mine it. He wanted to secure the deed fully before he told you. He died before he could finish." Sarah looked up, tears freezing on her lashes. The land the bank was trying to take, the land the mayor was harassing her for. It wasn't just poor soil. It was a gold mine. "That's why Higgins wants the land," Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He knows. Somehow, he knows. Elias's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching. "Then we have a problem. Because a man like Higgins doesn't stop because he lost an auction. He escalates." The sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised purple, when Elias dropped Sarah back at her farm. The farmhouse looked more fragile than ever. The porch sagged on the left side, and the windows rattled in the wind. Elias helped her down from the sleigh, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the property with a hunter's instinct. "I should go," Elias said. "It wouldn't be proper for me to be seen lingering after dark. Folks talk." "Let them talk," Sarah said, clutching the map in her pocket. "You changed everything today, Elias." "Thank you." He tipped his hat, the shadow concealing his eyes, but she saw the slight quirk of a smile. "Keep your doors locked, Sarah. And that map, hide it. Don't tell a soul." He climbed back into the cutter and rode off, the bells fading into the distance. Sarah watched him go until he was just a speck, feeling a sudden, crushing loneliness return. But this time, it was mixed with hope. She went inside, lit the kerosene lamp, and hid the map inside the hollow of the family Bible. She was just stoking the fire when a heavy pounding shook the front door. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a demand. Sarah grabbed the fire poker, her heart racing. "Who is it? Open up, Sarah. It's Mayor Higgins. I have Sheriff Coltrane with me." Sarah's blood ran cold. She unlocked the door. Mayor Josiah Higgins stood there, wrapped in a fine wool coat, flanked by the sheriff, a man whose loyalty belonged to whoever signed his paycheck. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Mayor?" Sarah asked, blocking the doorway. Higgins pushed past her, uninvited, walking into a small parlor. He looked around with a sneer, wrinkling his nose at the smell of wood smoke and poverty. "We need to talk about your situation, Sarah," Higgins said, pulling off his leather gloves. "And this stunt you pulled today with that savage Burke." "Mr. Burke is a gentleman," Sarah snapped, "which is more than I can say for some." Higgins laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "A gentleman? He's a drifter, Sarah, a violent man. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here to make you a final offer on the property." He pulled a document from his coat. $200, enough to pay off your debts and buy a ticket back east to your parents. "I have no parents, you know that," Sarah said, "and the land is worth more than $200, not without a husband to work it," Higgins countered. "Look, Sarah, I'm trying to be charitable, but the bank is calling the note." "The note isn't due until spring," Sarah argued, her voice rising. "Thomas signed it for April." Higgins smiled, a predatory expression that made Sarah grip the poker tighter. "Ah, see, that's where you're confused. There was a clause. In the event of the primary earner's death, the bank reserves the right to accelerate the repayment timeline. We reviewed the file this afternoon. The bank wants its money by noon tomorrow, or we foreclose." "Tomorrow?" Sarah screamed. "That's illegal. You can't do that." "I own the bank, Sarah," Higgins hissed, stepping closer, invading her space. "I can do whatever I please. You have until noon. Sell to me tonight for $200, or lose it all tomorrow for nothing." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And don't think your mountain man can help you. Sheriff Coltrane here has a warrant for Elias Burke's arrest. Something about an unpaid debt in Kansas. If he shows his face here again, he hangs." Sarah stared at him, horror washing over her. It was a lie. It had to be. But they had the law, the money, and the power. She was just a widow with a fire poker. "Get out," she whispered. "Noon, Sarah," Higgins said, donning his hat. "Don't be a fool." They left, slamming the door behind them. Sarah collapsed into the rocking chair, the poker clattering to the floor. Noon. She needed $500 to pay off the mortgage. She had the 5 gold coins Elias gave her, worth perhaps $100 at best if she traded them well. It wasn't enough. She looked at the Bible where the map was hidden. If she showed them the map, they would just kill her for it. The wind howled outside, sounding like a chorus of mourning women. Sarah put her head in her hands and wept. She had found a friend, found hope, and found a future, all in one afternoon, and now it was being stripped away. Crack! A sound from the backyard, not the wind. The distinct sound of wood splitting. Sarah froze. Had Higgins come back? She blew out the lamp and crept to the back window, wiping the frost away with her sleeve. The moon had risen, casting a pale blue light over the yard. There, by the woodpile, was a massive figure. He had taken off his buffalo coat and was in his shirt sleeves, despite the freezing temperature. The rhythm was steady, powerful. Swing, crack, swing, crack. It was Elias. He hadn't left. He was chopping her wood. Sarah watched, her breath hitching. He knew she was low on fuel. He knew she was in danger. He was staying close, guarding the perimeter like a silent sentinel. She wasn't alone. But as she watched, she saw something else. Shadows moving in the tree line beyond the fence. 3 men, keeping low, rifles glinting in the moonlight. Higgins hadn't just sent a threat. He had sent a hit squad to ensure Elias didn't interfere with the eviction. Elias had his back to them. The wind was blowing towards the house. He couldn't hear them coming. Sarah didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Thomas's old double-barreled shotgun from above the mantel, threw open the back door, and ran out into the snow in her stocking feet. "Elias, behind you! Elias, behind you!" The warning ripped through the frozen air. Elias didn't turn to look. He trusted Sarah's voice instinctively. He dropped to his knees just as the crack of a rifle shattered the night. A bullet chewed a chunk of wood out of the log he had been standing beside a heartbeat before. Elias moved with the terrifying speed of a cougar. He grabbed the handle of the splitting axe he'd been using, spun on his heel, and hurled it into the darkness. There was a dull thud and a pained yelp from the tree line. "Get down!" Elias roared at Sarah. Sarah didn't get down. She raised Thomas's shotgun, the heavy walnut stock bruising her shoulder, and pulled the trigger on the right barrel. The weapon bucked, spitting a tongue of orange fire into the night. She wasn't aiming to kill. She couldn't see them clearly. But the spray of buckshot shredded the branches where the shadows were hiding. "Damn it, she's armed!" a voice shouted. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a hired gun. "Flank him! Get the big one!" Elias didn't give them the chance. He sprinted across the yard, zigzagging through the snow, closing the distance to the fence line. He was a shadow among shadows. Sarah fumbled to reload, her fingers numb, but Elias was already there. He vaulted the fence, disappearing into the brush. The sounds of a scuffle erupted. Grunts, the crunch of snow, the sickening sound of a fist meeting bone. Then silence. 2 of the hired men broke cover and ran, terrified of the unseen beast in the bushes. "Sarah, the sleigh!" Elias's voice called out from the darkness. She ran to the barn, her breath tearing at her throat. Elias emerged from the trees, dragging his leg slightly, a dark stain blossoming on his white shirt. "You're hit," she gasped. "Just a scratch." "A graze," he grunted, wincing as he helped her harness the black stallion. "We can't stay here, Sarah. Higgins isn't playing games. If they didn't kill us tonight, they'll burn the house down with us inside it by morning." "But my home..." Sarah looked back at the farmhouse, the only place she had ever felt safe. "It's just wood and glass," Elias said, grabbing the reins. "The home is you, and if you want to keep that land, we have to survive the night." They scrambled into the cutter. Elias snapped the reins, and the stallion bolted. They didn't take the road. Elias steered them straight into the forest, weaving through ancient pines where no carriage was meant to go. Behind them, in the distance, a faint orange glow began to rise against the night sky. Sarah looked back and stifled a sob. They had torched the barn. The smoke was rising like a dark prayer to a cruel god. Higgins was trying to smoke them out, to force them toward the main road where the sheriff would be waiting. "He wants a war," Elias said through gritted teeth, his eyes scanning the dark woods. "I'm going to give him one." They rode for an hour, climbing higher into the mountains, leaving Oakhaven and its corruption far below. The wind bit at their faces, but the adrenaline kept the cold at bay. Finally, Elias slowed the horse near a rocky overhang, a natural shelter hidden by a curtain of spruce. He helped Sarah down, but as his boots hit the ground, his leg buckled. He fell to one knee, groaning. "Elias!" Sarah was at his side instantly. "I'm fine," he lied, trying to push himself up. "You are not fine," she commanded, her voice finding that steel Thomas had always admired. "Sit down. Let me look." She lit a small lantern from the sleigh's supplies. The bullet had torn through his thigh, a flesh wound, deep and ugly, but it hadn't hit the artery. Still, the blood was soaking his trousers. Sarah didn't hesitate. She tore a strip from her petticoat, the expensive lace she had saved for church, and began to bind the wound. Her hands, usually so gentle, worked with efficient pressure. Elias watched her, his face pale but his eyes burning with an intensity that made her shiver. "You shoot straight," he murmured. "I had to learn," she said, tying the knot tight. "Thomas couldn't hold a gun the last year." Elias reached out, his hand covering hers. It was trembling, not from pain, but from rage. "They won't get away with this, Sarah, I promise you. But we have a problem. The bank opens at 9. Higgins said noon. He'll have the sheriff watching the bank doors. If I show my face, they'll shoot me for resisting arrest before I can say a word." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, fear creeping back in. "We can't pay the mortgage if we can't get inside." Elias leaned his head back against the rock wall, closing his eyes. "I have the money, Sarah." Sarah stared at him. "What?" "I have the money," he repeated softly. "The $5 I paid for the basket. That wasn't all I had. I've been trapping and prospecting in these mountains for 15 years. I don't spend it on whiskey or cards. I bury it." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I have enough gold dust in my saddlebags to buy your farm 3 times over. But money is no good if a bullet stops you at the door." The night passed in a blur of cold and whispered plans. Under the shelter of the rock, wrapped together in the buffalo robe for warmth, the boundaries between them dissolved. Elias told her of his past, how he had lost his own family to a fever years ago, how he had retreated to the mountains to escape the grief, and how seeing her that morning on the auction block had awakened a part of his heart he thought was dead. Sarah listened, weeping silently. She realized that this man, this beast the town feared, was the most honorable soul she had ever met. By the time the sun began to bleed grey light over the eastern peaks, the plan was set. It was dangerous. It relied on the one thing Higgins didn't think they had: allies. "Are you sure about this?" Elias asked, checking the load in his rifle. He looked tired, his face drawn from blood loss, but he stood tall. "I'm sure," Sarah said. She reached up and touched his bearded cheek. "They think I'm just a helpless widow. They think you're a savage. We use that." Elias caught her hand and kissed the palm. "Ride fast, Sarah Miller." Sarah climbed into the sleigh. She took the reins, took a deep breath, and snapped them hard. The stallion, rested and fed, launched forward. She wasn't riding away from town. She was riding straight back into it. It was 8:30 a.m. when Sarah Miller's sleigh crested the hill overlooking Oakhaven. The town was waking up. Smoke curled from chimneys, but the atmosphere was tense. Sheriff Coltrane and 2 deputies were standing on the porch of the bank, rifles cradled in their arms, drinking coffee. They were waiting for Elias. Sarah slowed the horse to a trot. She pulled her hood up, obscuring her face. She looked small, defeated. As she rolled down Main Street, people stopped to watch. They saw the soot on her face from the fire at her barn. They saw the exhausted slump of her shoulders. "Poor thing," Mrs. Gable whispered from the sidewalk, though her eyes gleamed with curiosity. Higgins finally broke her. Sarah pulled the sleigh up in front of the general store, not the bank. She climbed down slowly, acting as if every movement pained her. She walked inside. The store was crowded. News of the fire had spread, and everyone was gathering for gossip. When Sarah entered, the silence was deafening. She walked straight to the counter, where old Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, stood. He had always been kind to her, sneaking her extra sugar when she couldn't pay. "Sarah," Henderson said gently, "I heard about the barn. I'm so sorry." "I need to send a telegram, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice loud enough for the room to hear. "To my cousin in St. Louis. I'm selling the farm to Mayor Higgins. I need a ticket out of here." A collective sigh of release went through the room. The drama was over. The widow had folded. "Of course," Henderson said, sliding a paper across the counter. Sarah leaned in, picking up the pencil. But she didn't write a telegram. She wrote 3 words on the paper, shielding it with her body so only Henderson could see. "Help me, please!" She looked up at Henderson, her eyes pleading. She slid a small, heavy object across the counter under her palm. It was one of the gold coins Elias had given her. Henderson looked at the coin, then at Sarah. He saw the terror in her eyes and the determination. He looked out the window at the sheriff's men laughing on the bank porch. He had known Sarah since she was a girl. He had known Thomas. And he knew Higgins was a crook who was squeezing the life out of Oakhaven. Henderson swallowed. He covered the coin with his hand. "I'll send it right away, Sarah, and I'll make sure the folks know you're leaving." "Thank you," she whispered. Tell them I'm saying goodbye at the church at noon. I want everyone there." She walked out. Word spread like wildfire. "The widow is leaving. She's saying goodbye at the church at noon." Higgins heard it in his office. He smiled, pouring himself a brandy. "Perfect." She surrendered. "Coltrane, you can relax. No need for violence today. Just have the deed ready for her to sign when she comes to beg for the $200. Higgins didn't know that noon wasn't just a time for goodbyes. It was the deadline, and Sarah wasn't going to the church to pray. At 11:45 a.m., the town square was packed. Everyone wanted to see the end of the spectacle. Higgins stood on the bank steps, looking benevolent. Then the church bells began to ring. Not a funeral toll, a frantic, clanging alarm. "Fire!" someone shouted. "Fire at the livery!" Smoke billowed from the other side of town, near the mayor's own stables. "My horses!" Higgins screamed, dropping his brandy glass. "Coltrane, get the men! Go!" The sheriff and his deputies hesitated, looking at the bank, then at the fire. "Go, you idiots!" Higgins roared. The lawmen took off, running towards the smoke. The crowd surged after them, eager for the excitement. The street in front of the bank cleared instantly, and that was when Elias Burke rode in. He didn't come in a sleigh. He came on a stolen horse, riding bareback, galloping down Main Street like one of the 4 horsemen. He wasn't hiding. He was screaming a war cry that chilled the blood. Higgins stood alone on the bank steps, his eyes widening in horror. He fumbled for the pistol inside his coat, but Sarah was closer. She had been hiding in the alleyway beside the bank. As Higgins reached for his gun, Sarah stepped out, wielding the double-barreled shotgun. "Don't!" she said, her voice cold as the winter wind. Higgins froze. He looked at the shotgun, leveled at his chest, held by the woman he had tried to crush. Elias pulled his horse to a sliding halt right in front of the steps. He leaped off, his injured leg holding firm under sheer will. He marched up the stairs, past the frozen mayor, and kicked the bank doors open. "We're here to make a deposit," Elias bellowed. He slammed a heavy leather sack onto the teller's counter. It burst open, spilling gold dust and nuggets across the ledger. $500 to clear the Miller mortgage, Elias growled at the terrified clerk, and $500 more to register a mining claim in the name of Sarah Miller. He turned to look at Higgins, who was standing in the doorway, the shotgun still aimed at his heart. "Noon," Elias said, pointing to the clock on the wall, which ticked over to 12 p.m. "Paid in full." The heavy oak doors of the First National Bank of Oakhaven didn't just swing open. They were kicked wide, with a force that rattled the plate-glass windows in their frames. The sudden intrusion shattered the hushed, reverent silence of the banking floor, where dust motes usually danced in the stillness of accrued interest and quiet desperation. Elias Burke stood in the threshold, a silhouette cut from iron and exhaustion. He was a terrifying sight to the civilized men inside. His white shirt was stained dark with blood at the thigh and shoulder. His buffalo coat hung open like the wings of a predatory bird, and his breathing was a ragged, animal sound. But it was his eyes, that stopped the room cold, black, dilated, and burning with a fury that promised violence. Beside him stood Sarah Miller. She looked nothing like the trembling widow who had stood on the auction block the day before. Her hair had come loose from its pins, wind-blown and wild. Her grey dress was smudged with soot from her burning barn. But in her hands, she held Thomas's double-barreled shotgun, broken open over her arm, suggesting a readiness to close it and fire at a moment's notice. "We're here to do business," Elias rasped. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the bank teller, a thin man named Mr. Abernathy, drop his pen. It rolled across the ledger with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Mayor Josiah Higgins stood near the vault, a crystal tumbler of brandy halfway to his mouth. The glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor and shattered, the amber liquid pooling like blood on the polished wood. "You," Higgins stammered, his face draining of color. "You're supposed to be arrested. You're supposed to be running." "I don't run," Elias growled, limping forward. Each step was heavy, punctuated by the thud of his boots and the jingling of his spurs. "And I don't steal. I pay what's owed." He reached the teller's counter, which was high enough to dwarf a normal man, but Elias leaned over it, casting a long shadow over Mr. Abernathy. He swung the heavy leather sack from his shoulder and let it drop, thud. The sound was heavy, dull, and dense. It was the sound of the earth's heart. The seam of the bag split under the impact, and a stream of coarse gold dust and pea-sized nuggets spilled out, glittering violently in the shaft of sunlight falling from the high windows. Abernathy gasped. He had seen gold before, coins mostly, or small pinches of dust from optimistic prospectors. He had never seen raw, jagged wealth like this. $500 to clear the mortgage on the Miller homestead, Elias said, his voice flat. And $500 more to file a mining claim on the North Creek Ridge. Sole owner, Sarah Miller. Higgins broke from his stupor. He scrambled forward, his expensive shoes crunching on the broken glass of his brandy tumbler. "No, don't touch that, Abernathy. It's stolen. That man is a vagrant, a drifter. He robbed a stagecoach. He robbed a train." "I dug it out of the rock with my own hands," Elias said, turning his head slowly to look at the mayor. "Which is more honest work than you've done in your entire life, Higgins." "It's invalid currency," Higgins shrieked, panic pitching his voice into a falsetto. "We don't accept raw ore. We need minted coin. United States tender." Sarah stepped forward then. She closed the shotgun with a sharp clack that echoed off the high ceiling. She didn't raise it, but the sound alone made Higgins flinch as if he'd been struck. "The bank charter, Article 4, Section 2, Sarah recited, her voice clear and cutting. "In the absence of specie, the bank shall accept raw gold, silver, or land deeds at current market value. Thomas made me read the charter before we signed the loan. Weigh it, Mr. Abernathy." Abernathy looked at Sarah, then at the shotgun, and finally at Higgins. The clerk was a small man, a man who had spent his life being bullied by Josiah Higgins. But he looked at the gold on the counter, more money than he made in 10 years, and he looked at the sheer, undeniable courage of the widow. "Weigh it," Elias commanded softly. Abernathy reached for his brass scales. His hands shook as he scooped the dust. The room watched in agonizing silence. Clink, clink, clink. The weights were added. The scale tipped, balanced, and then the gold side sank heavy. It's over $1,200 worth by current assay," Abernathy whispered. "More than enough." "Stamp it," Sarah said. "Stamp the deed paid in full." "Do not stamp that," Higgins roared, lunging for the counter. "I own this bank. I own this town. I will not be undone by a whore and a savage." The air left the room. Elias moved faster than a wounded man should be able to move. He didn't reach for his knife. He reached for Higgins. He grabbed the mayor by the lapels of his fine wool coat and slammed him backward into the iron bars of the teller's cage. The metal rang like a church bell. Elias leaned in, his face inches from the mayor's. The smell of pine, sweat, and old blood overwhelmed the scent of Higgins's cologne. "You watch your tongue," Elias hissed, a sound like steam escaping a boiler. "You tried to steal her land. You tried to burn her out. You sent hired killers to her door in the middle of the night. You are done giving orders." "Sheriff!" Higgins screamed, looking past Elias towards the open door. "Coltrane, help me! Shoot him!" The sound of boots pounding on the boardwalk outside announced the arrival of the law. Sheriff Coltrane burst through the door, his chest heaving from the run from the burning livery. 2 deputies crowded behind him, rifles drawn. "Drop it!" Coltrane shouted, leveling his Winchester at Elias's back. "Burke, step away from the mayor!" Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. He held Higgins pinned against the bars, his grip like a vice. "Sheriff!" Higgins gasped, his face turning purple. "He's robbing the bank! He assaulted me! Kill him!" Coltrane's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said step back, Burke, or I'll put a hole in you." "If you shoot him," Sarah said, her voice trembling but loud. "You'll have to shoot me too, Sheriff." She stepped between the sheriff's rifle and Elias's back. She didn't raise her shotgun. She just stood there, a human shield in a calico dress. "Sarah, move!" Coltrane barked, sweating. "This man is a criminal. He's a hero," a voice called out from the doorway. Coltrane spun around. The doorway was blocked. Not by deputies, but by the townspeople. Mr. Henderson, the storekeep, stood at the front. Behind him was the blacksmith, holding a heavy iron hammer. Behind them, Mrs. Gable, and the baker, and the schoolteacher. A wall of Oakhaven citizens. "We saw the fire, Sheriff," Henderson said, stepping into the bank. "We saw who started it. It wasn't Elias Burke. It was Higgins' men trying to create a diversion." "Lies!" Higgins sputtered. "And we heard about the eviction," the blacksmith added, hefting his hammer. "Trying to throw a widow out in the snow a day before Christmas? That ain't the law, Coltrane. That's cruelty." Coltrane looked at the crowd. He looked at Higgins, who was sobbing with rage and fear. He looked at Sarah, standing firm with love and defiance in her eyes, and he looked at the gold on the counter. Coltrane slowly lowered his rifle. He uncocked the hammer. "Sheriff," Higgins whispered, horrified. "What are you doing? I pay your salary." "The town pays my salary, Josiah," Coltrane said tiredly. He holstered his gun, "and it looks to me like a private business transaction has just been concluded. The mortgage is paid." Elias released Higgins. The mayor slid down the bars to the floor, coughing, straightening his crumpled cravat. But his power had evaporated. He looked up and saw not fear, but contempt in the eyes of his town. "Get out," Elias said to Higgins, "before I change my mind about the mountain coming down on you." Higgins scrambled to his feet and ran. He pushed past the sheriff, pushed through the crowd, and fled into the street, a king without a kingdom. Abernathy brought the heavy stamp down on the document. "Thump. Paid in full," the clerk announced, handing the paper to Sarah. She took it, her fingers brushing the ink that was still wet. It was over. She turned to Elias. The adrenaline that had held him upright was fading. He swayed, his face going ashen. "Elias!" Sarah dropped the shotgun and caught him as he buckled. "I'm all right," he mumbled, his eyes losing focus. "Just lost a little more blood than I thought." "Help him!" Sarah cried out. The blacksmith and Henderson rushed forward, catching the mountain man's massive weight before he hit the floor. They carried him out of the bank, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. The ride back to the farm was a blur of pain and relief. They didn't stop in town for the accolades. Sarah insisted on getting him home. They laid him in the bed Thomas had built, the bed that had been cold for so long. The doctor came and went, stitching the wound, muttering about constitutions of oxen and miracles. Night fell. It was Christmas Eve. The farmhouse was quiet. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Elias lay propped up on pillows, his leg bandaged, his face clean of the grime and blood. Sarah sat beside him, holding a mug of broth. She watched him sleep for an hour, terrified that if she looked away, he might vanish like smoke. His eyes fluttered open. They were dark, warm, and lucid. "You're still here," he rasped. "Where else would I be?" Sarah smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Elias tried to sit up, wincing. "I need to go, Sarah. Soon as I can stand." Sarah's hand froze. "Go? Go where?" "Back to the high country," Elias said, looking away from her, staring into the fire. "I did what I came to do. You're safe. You have the gold. You don't need a broken-down trapper cluttering up your life." "Is that what you think you are?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "Clutter?" "I'm a wild thing, Sarah," Elias said, his voice heavy with a lifetime of loneliness. "I don't know how to sit at a table. I don't know how to talk at socials. I kill things for a living. Today was a fight. I'm good at fights. But tomorrow is just living. And I don't know if I fit in a house with curtains and a Bible." He looked at her then, his expression agonizingly vulnerable. "Folks will talk. They'll say you took in a stray dog. You deserve a gentleman." "Nah." Sarah set the broth down on the nightstand with a sharp clink. She stood up, her eyes flashing with that same fire that had cowed the mare. "I had a gentleman," Sarah said softly. "Thomas was a gentleman, and he was a good man. But he's gone." She stepped closer to the bed. "And then I stood on a stage and begged for someone to see me. To see me, Sarah Miller. And the gentlemen of this town looked at their boots, the banker, the lawyer, the shopkeepers. They let me drown." She sat on the edge of the bed and took his rough, calloused hands in hers. "Only one man looked up," she whispered. "Only one man walked through a blizzard and paid a fortune for a basket of stale biscuits just to give a widow her dignity back. You think that makes you a savage, Elias Burke? That makes you the finest man I have ever known." Elias stared at her, his breath hitching in his chest. "Sarah, I don't need a man to wear a silk tie," she said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I need a man who will chop my wood when I'm tired. I need a man who will stand between me and the wolves. I need you." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "Don't go back to the cold, Elias. Please, stay. Stay and be warm." The walls he had built around his heart for 20 years, walls of ice and silence and solitude, crumbled in a single heartbeat. He realized that the gold in the mountains, the freedom of the trails, the silence of the peaks, none of it was worth as much as the woman sitting before him. He freed one hand from hers and cupped her face, his thumb wiping away a tear. "I ain't got much to offer," he whispered hoarsely. "Just a mule, a rifle, and a bad leg. And a heart," Sarah added. "That's all I want." "Then it's yours," he said. "It's been yours since you walked onto that stage." He kissed her then. It wasn't the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss of survival they had shared earlier. It was slow, deep, and filled with a promise of forever. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the scars on the land, covering the burnt barn, covering the tracks of the men who had tried to hurt them. Inside, there was only warmth. They were married 3 days later, right there in the parlor. There was no minister, the roads were snowed in. So Mr. Henderson read from the good book, and the sheriff signed the witness papers, leaving his gun belt by the door. Elias didn't wear a suit. He wore his cleanest flannel shirt and polished his boots until they shone. Sarah wore her grey dress, but she pinned a sprig of evergreen and holly to her collar. In the spring, they didn't sell the land. They worked it. They mined the ridge, pulling enough gold from the earth to build a barn that was the envy of the territory, painted bright red, with a loft that smelled of sweet hay. They built a new fence, strong and tall, but they also built a table, a long table that sat on the porch, where anyone passing by, hungry or cold, could stop for a meal. Mayor Higgins moved to St. Louis a month after the incident, his reputation in Oak Haven ruined. He died penniless a few years later, a man who had chased gold his whole life and never understood its value. Elias and Sarah grew old on that mountain. They raised 3 children, strong and wild and kind. And every year, on the anniversary of the Christmas box social, Elias would clear the table. He would take a small velvet pouch from the mantelpiece and pour out 5 heavy gold coins. He would look at his wife, whose hair had turned to silver, and he would smile the smile of a man who had won the greatest lottery in the world. "Nobody bid on the basket," he would say, his voice rumbly and warm. And Sarah would cover his hand with hers and reply, "Nobody but the one who mattered." What a journey! From the depths of humiliation to the heights of redemption, Sarah and Elias proved that true worth isn't found in a bank account, but in the courage to stand for what's right. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest blessings come disguised as the hardest moments. I'd love to hear from you. What was your favorite part of the story? Was it the showdown at the bank, or that quiet moment by the fire? Drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale of frontier justice and romance, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these stories with more people. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new adventure. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.